As more and more people respond to the clarion call to contribute towards a successful fight against COVID-19, the call for transparency and accountability in the disbursement and dispensation of such collected funds continue to grow louder. Joining us now for a discussion around this and other related matters is Bekeme Masade-Olowola, Chief Executive Officer of CSR-in-Action, a non-governmental organization that seeks to engender a culture of corporate social responsibility. Welcome to the program, Bekeme.
Thank you, Dr. Abati.
Yes, good to have you here. Well, let's start with businesses. Do you think that they have extended corporate philanthropy during this pandemic? We know that there is COVID, that is the private sector coalition. Do you think they've done well enough? Do you think that they need to do more?
Thank you, Dr. Abati. So thank you. I'm sure you know CSR-in-Action personally yourself, but just to correct something, we're not just a non-profit, we also are now a consulting firm, because when we started, we tried to say companies needed to do certain things, but companies said, you know what, we need help doing them. So now we actually help companies do that. Now, COVID, which is a private sector coalition, I think has really, really stepped up to the plate in terms of contribution to government coffers this period. There are also smaller groups, or rather less popular groups like the We Are Together.ng group, made up of smaller businesses that are also giving back to the society. But the thing is, they've been giving out a lot of cash. They've been giving out a lot of relief materials. They've been giving out test kits and other PPE and all of that. So I do think that, to answer your question before we deviate, to answer your question, I do think that the private sector has stepped in big time. The only thing we are concerned about now is what the government is doing. So COVID is independent, and then the private sector has also contributed to government coffers. You understand that? So the government now has its management framework for disbursing these funds. They called it the framework for the management of COVID-19 in Nigeria, which is the first time we're having this sort of thing in Nigeria. But then the private sector keeps on doing what he knows how to do best, engage with its critical stakeholders. So yes, I do think that the private sector has been instrumental in easing the burden on the society.
Indeed, the private sector has really rallied and has raised more than 27 billion naira so far towards the COVID-19 pandemic. But earlier, you were, in response to Dr. Abati, you were saying how you show organizations how they should implement corporate philanthropy. Let's talk about why it's imperative, even in spite of the challenges that a lot of companies are facing now.
Okay, so private sector organizations have an impact on the societies in which they're situated, right? So especially when you think about businesses that have to do with extractives, for instance, okay, they have positive and negative impacts, and they must manage these positive and negative impacts. And the way that they engage with their societies or the communities in which they operate is important to minimize or to mitigate any negative impacts. And so that's why you hear concepts like business sustainability strategy. It's not just a separate strategy to have. You shouldn't have a separate sustainability strategy and a separate business strategy. Your business from the get-go should bear in mind that there are key stakeholders that you must engage with, who influence your business and who gets direct impacts from your business. And as such, in order to get the social license to operate, you have to look after the needs. That's why right now in the US and other parts of the world, you're talking about corporate social justice. It's not just about giving just for the sake of giving. It's actually looking at your business and seeing that you have impacts on people, on the staff who work with you, their families. And so if we're talking about racism in the US, for instance, we should be talking about tribalism. In Nigeria, we have banks that are known for certain ethnic groups. That should not be the case. And it creates a certain injustice. Everybody fights about federal character, blah, blah, blah. But then those kinds of policies are there for a reason, even though they're supposed to be there for a finite period to correct an anomaly. So businesses have a duty, self-regulated duty, really, to do what they need to do to manage any negative impacts on the community, in the society in which they're situated. It's for their long-term benefit. They get brand equity from doing that. The fact that they're able to communicate well with their stakeholders also mean that their stakeholders become their ambassadors. They don't need to spend as much on advertising. And the most important thing is that they have a chance of being there for the longest time, to have the opportunity to be at least 100 years old. If you look at Tata of India, even before people started talking about welfare packages for staff, women empowerment, and all of that, Tata had already incorporated that into their business strategy. And that's why Tata is at least 135 years old now, because it has become such a household name in India. People understand that this is a business that cares for them. And so people want to constantly associate with that business.
Right. Bekeme, it's good to see you again. This is Rufai. Hi. What are the best approach? I'm talking about, to corporate philanthropy. And let us use this COVID-19 as a case study. What would you have suggested that the coalition of corporate entities do as regards the best approach? Because a lot of people say the palliatives are not going around. It's not even effective in society. So what would have been the best approach? What would have? Do you think they should have just given businesses money, other small businesses? Because 89% of small businesses said they would like if the government could give them money. Would that have been the best approach to reflect the economy? What's the best approach?
Okay, so it depends. Nigeria has many foundational issues when it comes to these things. If you look at what has happened in the past with regard to giving smaller businesses money, we have always had challenges with retrieving that money, with getting that money back. It doesn't appear that we have systems to make sure that people are accountable. So yes, while it's a good idea to sort of stimulate that economy, you also have to bear in mind that people have also been stuck at home, and we're still talking about the need to physically distance. I mean, WHO has corrected it's not social distancing because of mental health issues that may arise, but we need to physically distance. So even when you do that, we are having challenges with people actually coming out and participating as they should. I do think that it is not the private sector's responsibility to buoy the economy up at this time, although it is a good thing for them to do. Mentioned about the contribution that was made to government, and the government, it's over 40 billion actually. Sent a letter to the Minister of Finance asking how exactly they would manage the funds, all right? Because private sector has made all of these major contributions. The government is the one who's supposed to provide oversight over us as citizens, and so we're wondering, what are you doing, government, with those funds? And that's why I did mention the fact that they came up with that framework. And the framework, even though the framework is the first of its kind in our economy, there's still pertinent questions being asked. How is it going to be used? What specifically would it be used for? So yes, one of the business case that you just made for small businesses is one of them. But in terms of private sector businesses by themselves, a good corporate social responsibility strategy must take into cognizance the business itself. Okay, so if you're a business that's in insurance, for instance, I have argued that the first thing that you must do in an article that I wrote recently is look at your key stakeholders, that is, the people who buy insurance from you. What can you do for them? And in the case of WAPIC, they decided, you know what, let's give 50% of the premium for the lockdown period back to our consumers, back to our customers, as opposed to just randomly giving out cash to many other people. So it's a case that businesses have to think about the fact that whatever giving that they do comes back and reflects on their business. So that's my take on that. Every business would have its own unique approach to addressing this. So a company like Unilever, for instance, has been sponsoring businesses, smaller businesses, helping them to open little kiosks, branded kiosks, in order that they empower themselves. So we need to also address those challenges, like I mentioned earlier, like the gender issue that has been happening, the gender-based violence that we're dealing with, the tribalism that we're dealing with. If we don't solve those issues and the government comes up with a policy to help SMEs, how do we not know that such funding would go to just a particular group of people? Same thing with the businesses. How do we know that, for some reason, it's only a certain demography would benefit of it? So it's continuous engagement, close engagement, better communication that would help this to work better.
Well, Bekeme, all of this is interesting, but you have talked about business sustainability, you've talked about business continuity, and then, of course, the need for businesses to align their operations with current trends. But the major concern is that here in Nigeria, many of the businesses have been saying they've been really terribly affected. How do they take care of the interests of stakeholders? What must they do, particularly with regard to keeping their staff? When some companies tried to retrench staff, people started protesting. But we'll take a short break now. When we return, you can address those questions. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Still with us is Bekeme Masade-Olowola, Chief Executive Officer of CSR-in-Action, and a consulting firm also, in addition to being a non-governmental organization. Anyway, Bekeme, to go back to the question I was asking you before we went on break, you had talked about stakeholder interest. Would that stakeholder interest in terms of CSR by corporate Nigeria include not retrenching staff and not cutting salaries?
You put me in a tough spot. So definitely not. So I remember that there was a big blowout right after the lockdown was announced, and obviously businesses started suffering under the weight of the new reality. And the Searching Bank put out information that they were having to retrench non-essential staff as a result of the new difficulties. And I remember that my first thought was, well, if the business needs to be around a long time, then they have to do what they need to do. And there was criticism that they had given out a certain amount of money whilst they were retrenching staff. But then if you look at it logically, you would find that the money that was actually giving out was only a fraction of the cost of actually keeping those staff. So it would mean that, if they had kept the staff, they would have had to carry that burden for a long time. But what was interesting for me was the fact that for the first time, I mean, we hear about banks just retrenching staff and all of that typically. But in this case, there was actually a town hall meeting where they had a conversation with staff, and purportedly staff said, you know what, this is the right thing to do, instead of actually, so because it was non-essential staff. So for instance, nobody's driving anyway, right? So why are we keeping on drivers? And the staff said, you know what, instead of the permanent staff to actually even face any retrenchment, we're happy to get pay cuts. And that's what was done. But then obviously somebody was still aggrieved and thought, okay, why should we even do this in the first place? But if they didn't do that, would we have such an institution today? But in retrospect, it is also clear that perhaps they could have waited a little bit more and considered how they could manage this differently, because there was a panic. Nobody knows what the outcome of this would be. And at the time, nobody knew what would happen next. So it was such a big deal. But like I said, communication is still always the way to go. And it brings to mind Airbnb, when they were going to let staff go. There was a very detailed, almost love letter type email sent to all their staff saying, this is what we must do because this is what we must do. We don't have any choice about it. And this is how we're going to manage, buoy up the staff that we have to let go because of this situation. So basically, there needs to be that conversation had. Now, in terms of businesses dealing at this time, I've said that they would have to do what they have to do, but they also have to stop and think at every point whether this is the best move to make. And I do think that government can play a huge role in systematically bailing out businesses at this time. They've been doing little pockets of things like the Bank of Industry, SME grants and funding and all of that. And I also heard that some of the government funding that was contributed is being used as smaller grants funding, rather, loans to smaller businesses. But I do think that they can step in for big business, and they can perhaps look into regulatory forbearances for bigger businesses. I once wrote, an article on tax and how, at a time when they've just increased VAT from 5% to 7.5%, I think they need to think about bringing it back down, and they need to sort of relax a little bit as well on, the payment of taxes. That's not, what are you paying tax on that you cannot bear, that you cannot get the benefit of? Taxation has always been a critical, big issue in our part of the world. So do you wait for people to pay taxes first, or do you make them pay and then the people demand that the taxes are used well? However, at this point in time, I'm still saying that obviously it's a great idea to keep on paying taxes, but can the government at this point look at reducing taxes or, giving some time off, some tax relief for businesses, big and small? Smaller business are already protected somewhat by the Constitution, but, the bigger businesses, is there something that the government can do to make it easier for them?
But our tax men will tell you that the government desperately needs the revenue now that oil prices have performed how they have in the wake of this pandemic. Now, earlier, I was actually quoting the CBN Director of Communications, and he placed the COVID donations at 27.1 billion. That's the last report that has been made public, but you might know, you have inside information. But I wanted to address the criticisms that have been made of COVID and that whole consortium, and why they had to pool their funds with the Central Bank of Nigeria. Some critics say that they should just have reached out directly, because once you involve the government, then you don't have control. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so as far as I know, COVID is running its own secretariat. And based on my conversations with some of the members of COVID, as far as I know, they're running an independent secretariat, and there have been contributions made to the government. And that you have to bear in mind that the government has also received multilateral contributions as well. So as far as I know, contributions to government funding is over the stated amount. Now, in terms of COVID funding government as opposed to funding, so again, like I said, let me separate that. So there's COVID, and COVID is directly impacting on its communities as well. They're giving back directly to communities. But in terms of the things that they're doing through the government, there's argument that they have no choice, because they have to be governed by the government. Federal government, state governments have a strong influence over business. And in our society, in every society, you have to, in some way, assuage, government motions, or so to speak. And so you must bear in mind that for them to keep on doing business, they have to look after the critical stakeholder of government. And so they go there, and then they're smart enough to bring it back down to the individual level. Now, in terms of that individual level, it had been asked in a certain way before. Businesses then have to find more direct ways of getting in touch with the people that need this the most. For instance, civil society organizations, non-profit organizations, it is their business to be amongst the people and to help the people. So if they can work with reputable non-profit organizations who are working in the different critical areas, then it is best to work through those organizations, even if it's a matter of giving out loans or giving out grants. Those people have everyday interactions with the people that need the most and can make that more impactful the most.
Right. Bekeme, real quickly, COVID-19 has brought very unprecedented circumstances across the business space. Real quickly, what should businesses be doing as we speak right about now as regards to CSR?
I go back to the concept of social justice that I talked about. The businesses that have their finger on the pulse of the people the best at this point in time are the businesses that will be around for a longer time. Those businesses need to find ways to be as close as to build as close a relationship as possible with their critical stakeholders, because human beings are emotional, and sometimes you see fantastic products, fantastic ads that may not connect with people, and people would rather go for a brand that they've known a long time. If you think about a brand like Alabukun, it's been around a long time. There was no need for advertising, but people just feel like this is our own, and the average laborer on the streets would use that product. So that sense of ownership from stakeholders is needed. And so businesses must find innovative ways of communicating more and communing more with these stakeholders. And you know that these stakeholders involve investors, they involve your employees who will, who have to be in your business for your business to thrive and to grow. They include your consumers, they include the government, they include the media. So every time that a business needs to take an action, the business needs to stop and think, how will my actions impact on these key stakeholders? When you have the answers to those, then you can prepare a strategy that works best for your business.
Well, thank you very much, Bekeme Masade-Olowola. Thank you very much indeed. Olowola, rather. I'm sorry about that. Thank you.